The red recording light flickered in Electric Lady Studios on that February night in 1981, and Bob Ezrin, the man who had transformed Alice Cooper into a rock opera maestro and turned Pink Floyd's The Wall into a cultural monument, stood behind the mixing console with his hands trembling. Not from fear, from rage. Across the soundproof glass, Ace Frehley sat with his silver Gibson Les Paul, a half-empty bottle of Jack Daniels at his feet, and an expression that said he'd rather be anywhere else on earth. What happened in that studio over the next 72 hours would not only fracture one of rock music's most successful partnerships, but would also expose the fault lines that had been quietly tearing Kiss apart since the moment Ace's solo album outsold the rest of the bands combined. This wasn't just a clash between a legendary producer and a rebellious guitarist. This was a war over creative control, artistic vision, and the very soul of what Kiss was supposed to be. And by the time the smoke cleared, Bob Ezrin would deliver an ultimatum that nobody saw coming. Either Ace Frehley leaves, or I do. Before we dive deeper into this untold story, if you're fascinated by the real stories behind rock's greatest legends, hit that subscribe button. We're bringing you the moments that shaped music history, one revelation at a time. To understand the explosion that occurred in 1981, you need to rewind to 1976, when Bob Ezrin first walked into the Kiss universe. The band was riding high on the success of Alive, but Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley knew they needed something more sophisticated, something that would elevate them beyond the pyrotechnics and platform boots. Bob Ezrin brought that credibility wrapped in gold records. He was the architect behind Destroyer, the album that gave Kiss Detroit Rock City and Beth, proving the band in demon makeup could actually make teenage girls cry. Ezrin saw potential in Kiss that even they hadn't fully realized, and for a brief moment, the collaboration worked like magic. Ace Frehley, in particular, had respected Ezrin's vision back then. The producer understood guitars in a way few people in the industry did, and he recognized that Ace's bluesy, melodic approach mixed with hard rock aggression was the secret weapon Kiss had been underutilizing. During the Destroyer sessions, Ezrin had actually encouraged Ace to step forward, to take more solos, to let his personality shine through the Space Ace character. But that was 1976. By 1981, everything had changed. The success of Ace's 1978 solo album had rewritten the power dynamics within Kiss in ways nobody had anticipated. When New York Groove became a legitimate hit, outselling anything Gene or Paul had released on their solo efforts, it proved something dangerous. Ace Frehley didn't need Kiss as much as Kiss needed him. The quiet guitarist who had always been content to stand in the shadows suddenly had leverage, and more importantly, he had confidence. He started questioning decisions. He pushed back on arrangements. He wanted more of his songs on albums, more creative input, more respect. Gene and Paul, who had always operated Kiss like a well-oiled corporate machine with themselves as the CEOs, found this new version of Ace deeply threatening. They needed someone who could rein him back in, someone who could remind Ace that he was part of a brand, not a solo artist. They called Bob Ezrin. It would prove to be a catastrophic miscalculation. By the time Ezrin arrived at Electric Lady Studios in early 1981 to begin work on what would become the music from the Elder album, the tension within Kiss was already at a breaking point. Peter Criss had been fired the year before, though the public didn't know it yet, and the band was secretly using session drummer Alan Schwartzberg. Ace was showing up late to sessions, sometimes not showing up at all. His drinking had intensified, and worst of all, he had started to openly mock the concept that Ezrin and the band were pursuing. A rock opera a concept album about some mystical elder and a boy's journey to enlightenment. Ace thought it was pretentious garbage. He said so, loudly, often. And Bob Ezrin, a man who had worked with artists who treated the studio like a sacred temple, was not accustomed to being mocked. The first real blow-up happened on February 12, 1981, during the tracking session for a song called The Oath. Ezrin had spent hours crafting an arrangement that required precision, multiple guitar layers, and a specific tonal quality. Ace walked in 3 hours late, the smell of whiskey preceding him. And when Ezrin handed him the sheet music and explained the arrangement, Ace glanced at it for maybe 5 seconds before dropping it on the floor. "I don't read music," Ace said, his voice flat and disinterested. "Never have. Just tell me what you want and I'll play it." Ezrin's face went red. "Then listen to the demo I made and replicate it exactly," he said, voice tight with controlled frustration. Ace put on the headphones, listened for maybe 30 seconds, then started playing something completely different. Not worse, not better, just different. It was a blues-based riff that had nothing to do with the mystical, orchestral vibe Ezrin was pursuing. "That's not what I played on the demo," Ezrin said through the talkback microphone. "I know," Ace replied, still playing. "This is better." What happened next would define the entire session. Ezrin stood up so fast his chair fell backward. He pressed the intercom button and said, very slowly and clearly, "If you play one more note that isn't what I asked for, I'm walking out of this studio and I'm never coming back." Ace, to his credit or detriment depending on your perspective, kept playing. Just kept those blues licks rolling, his eyes closed, completely in his own world. Ezrin turned to Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley, who were sitting on the couch in the control room. "You need to handle this," Ezrin said. "Now." Gene and Paul exchanged a look that spoke volumes. This was their opportunity to let someone else be the bad guy, to let Ezrin take the blame for what they had wanted to do for months, put Ace in his place or get him out entirely. Paul walked to the glass, tapping on it until Ace opened his eyes. "Take 5. We need to talk." When Ace came into the control room, the atmosphere was suffocating. Bob Ezrin stood with arms crossed, legendary patience completely evaporated. Paul played the mediator role he had mastered over the years. "Ace, we hired Bob because he's the best. When he asks you to play something a certain way, it's not a suggestion, it's the arrangement. If you can't follow that, we have a serious problem." Ace looked at all 3 of them, and something shifted in his expression. Later, he would tell friends this was the moment he realized the truth. This wasn't about music anymore. This was about control. "Fine," Ace said quietly. "I'll play whatever Bob wants. But just so we're clear, this album is going to be a commercial disaster, and you all know it." The room went silent. Because Ace was right, and admitting it would mean admitting he had better instincts than they did. So they doubled down. "We're not making music for the lowest common denominator anymore," Ezrin said coldly. "We're making art. If you can't understand that, maybe you're in the wrong room." The line had been drawn. Over the next 3 days, Bob Ezrin instituted a recording schedule designed to be punishing. Sessions would start at noon and run until 4 or 5 in the morning. Ace would be required to do take after take, even when his playing was technically perfect, because Ezrin claimed he was chasing a specific emotional quality that Ace wasn't delivering. It was psychological warfare disguised as artistic perfectionism. Ace responded with passive-aggressive compliance. He would play exactly what Ezrin asked for, note perfect, with absolutely zero soul or feeling. It was technically flawless and emotionally dead, his way of saying you can force a musician to play notes, but you can't force him to give you his heart. On the second day, things escalated. Ezrin asked Ace to layer 6 different guitar tracks for a single section, each with a slightly different tone and effect. This meticulous layering was Ezrin's signature style, what made the wall sound so massive. But it required patience, precision, and buy-in from the musician. Ace did the first 3 layers without complaint. On the 4th layer, he deliberately played slightly out of tune. Not enough that a casual listener would notice, but enough that Ezrin, with his trained ear, would absolutely hear it. When Ezrin pointed it out and asked him to redo it, Ace looked directly at him and said, "Sounded fine to me. Maybe your speakers are blown." The tension could have been cut with a knife. "Tune your guitar," Ezrin said through clenched teeth. "Now." This went on for hours. Ace would play the wrong part, apologize, ask for clarification, play it slightly wrong again. It was death by 1,000 cuts, a masterclass in how a musician could technically comply while making the producer's life hell. By the 3rd day, the war had moved into open hostility. Ace showed up at 6 in the evening, 6 hours after the scheduled start, with no apology. Ezrin had been sitting in the control room for those entire 6 hours, refusing to leave. When Ace finally walked in, Ezrin pressed the talkback button. "Guitar solo on track 7. You have 1 hour." It was an insult. Ace could nail a solo in 2 or 3 takes. Ezrin was saying he expected Ace to fail. Ace plugged in, listened to the track once, and laid down a solo in a single take that was technically brilliant and emotionally powerful. Then he unplugged and said, "Done. Anything else?" Ezrin sat in silence, listening intently for any flaw. There was nothing. It was perfect. "That's the take," Ezrin finally said, and there was something in his voice that might have been respect or defeat. On February 15th, Bob Ezrin called a meeting away from the studio. Gene, Paul, and manager Bill Aucoin were present. Ace was not invited. Ezrin came with a folder full of notes, budget breakdowns, and studio logs showing exactly how much time and money had been wasted. "I can't work with Ace anymore," Ezrin said, voice steady but tired. "It's not about talent. He's one of the most naturally gifted guitarists I've ever recorded. But he's actively sabotaging this project, and he's miserable. You can hear it in everything he plays." Gene saw his opening immediately. "So what are you suggesting?" Ezrin looked at them and said the words that would seal Ace's fate. "Either Ace leaves, or I walk away from this project, and you can explain to the label why your album is half finished." Paul asked the question that saved him some sleep. "Can we finish with session players? Keep Ace's name on the record but bring in someone else?" Ezrin nodded. "Bob Kulick could do it. He knows Kiss's sound, and he'll do exactly what I ask." Bob Kulick was the guitarist who had almost joined Kiss before Ace got the gig in 1973. We tell Ace we're taking a break. During that time, Kulick finishes the guitar work. When Ace comes back, we tell him the tracks are done. We minimize his involvement, finish the album, avoid a public explosion. Bill Aucoin nodded slowly. Gene and Paul agreed in less than 10 minutes. "We've been carrying Ace for 2 years, Gene said, a statement both true and wildly unfair. The decision was made. Bob Kulick would be called that afternoon. Ace would be told there was a recording hiatus, but Ace wasn't stupid. When he got the call about a sudden 2-week break right in the middle of tracking, he knew exactly what it meant. He was being phased out. During the hiatus, Ace contacted his lawyer about his contract, particularly clauses regarding album credits and royalties. What he discovered gave him leverage. Kiss could replace his parts, but he had to approve the final mix of any track bearing his name. It was small leverage, but it was something. Meanwhile, Bob Kulick came in to complete the guitar work. Kulick later spoke about this with obvious discomfort. I knew Ace wasn't officially out, but it was clear Gene and Paul wanted him out. I felt like I was helping them erase someone. Track by track, Ace's original parts were removed. Kulick's playing was technically flawless, but lacked Ace's distinctive character. That slightly sloppy, blues-inflected vibrato, the way he bent strings just sharper than perfect pitch. Bob Ezrin noticed this. In pursuit of technical perfection, he had eliminated what made Kiss's guitar sound special. But by this point, there was no going back. When the 2 weeks were up, Ace came in to hear the tracks. When they played him the songs where his parts had been replaced, he listened in silence. Then he said very calmly, "That's not me playing." Paul started to explain, but Ace cut him off. "I'm not stupid. What I want to know is if you're planning to credit me for guitar work I didn't perform." Gene recognized the legal trap immediately. "We'll figure out the credits. Right now, we need you to do some overdubs so your playing is represented. Then we can discuss the rest." Ace nodded slowly. "After this album, I'm done. You two have made it clear you don't want me here, and I'm tired of fighting about it." The relief on their faces was almost comical. Ace did his overdubs that day. Professional, efficient, emotionally detached. The war was over, and everyone had lost something. Music from The Elder was released in November 1981 and was, as Ace predicted, a commercial disaster. It sold fewer than 500,000 copies, catastrophic by Kiss standards. The album Ezrin fought so hard to perfect proved that Ace's instincts had been correct. By removing him from the creative process, they removed what made Kiss appealing. Gene and Paul moved forward with Vinnie Vincent as Ace's replacement. Kiss continued for decades, but something fundamental had changed. The wild energy Ace brought was gone. They had traded authenticity for consistency, soul for professionalism. The studio war of 1981 represented the fundamental tension in commercial rock between artistic expression and product creation. Everyone had a point. Everyone was also missing the bigger picture. Kiss's greatest strength had always been the tension between different forces, not the elimination of one in favor of another. Ace survived and played guitar for 40 more years. Ezrin continued producing masterpieces. Gene and Paul built Kiss into a billion-dollar brand. But the magic of those 1970s recordings, where Ace was fully engaged, continues to inspire new generations who hear in his slightly imperfect, emotion-drenched solos something worth emulating.